Nigeria's debt stock currently stands at 32.91 trillion naira as at December the 31st, 2020. This is made up of borrowings from the federal government, the 36 states of the Federation, and the Federal Capital Territory.
If there is any request.
Recently, the Senate approved $1.5 billion and 995 million euros external loan requests of the President, adding to the existing borrowings. Considering the fact that debt to GDP ratio is at 40%, the challenge now is debt service to revenue ratio. Is the government generating enough revenue to pay down their debt as they mature?
The share of the deficit to be funded by borrowing is 95.43%. The other financing items is revenues that will be coming in as financing items on the proceeds of privatization.
A look at the debt stock shows that Lagos tops the list of states with external and domestic debt, despite heavy reliance on internally generated revenues and the Federation Accounts Allocation Committee for funding. Meanwhile, all the states and the FCT generated a sum of 1.31 trillion naira internally in 2020, a drop from 1.33 trillion naira in 2019. The impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has left government financial obligations remarkably higher. IGRS and FAC have also nosedived.
The very critical component, which is...
The Director General of the Debt Management Office shares insight on the best way out of this.
State governments have your own laws, okay? We have one, we have a DMO Act, have an equivalent at the state level. Again, if you remember what I said, legislations and institutions are what make countries work.
Since the recession experienced in 2016, Nigeria has struggled with a higher debt service to revenue ratio as revenue slid in direct correlation with a fall in oil prices. Traditionally, only Lagos and Ogun states meets 50% of their revenue from IGRs, while some states get as much as 80% of their revenues from the Federation accounts. This has made some states go back to the renegotiation table on servicing non-performing debt. The real issue is the ability of the government to raise the needed revenue to meet up with borrowings.
If your total borrowing is small relative to your GDP, other countries have 80, over 100%, ours is less than 22%. But in those countries, debt service to revenue is 10% or 15%, because the countries have revenues from taxes and duties that people pay. Are you with me? So here we don't have that revenue. That's why debt service to revenue is high. So what is our worry? That debt service to revenue is high, not the absolute size of the debt stock.
With oil prices still below expectation and persisting COVID-19, it is likely that Nigeria would be forced to rely more on debt and grants to shore up its falling revenue. However, states have been urged to take drastic measures to reduce expenses and look inward in revving up their revenue base.
Let's discuss this issue further, and we're being joined by the Director General of the Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Mr. Muda Yusuf. A pleasure having you with us.
Thank you very much. Good evening to you.
With the country's debt stock almost at 33 trillion naira and a borrowing plan of over 4 trillion naira this year, should we be worried about how to sustain the debt burden amidst a fall in revenue?
Yes, of course. We should be worried, particularly from the point of view of the capacity to service the debt. In 2020, for instance, debt service to revenue was close to 80%. In the current budget, this 2021 budget, the debt service provision was about 3.2 trillion. This is huge. And clearly, the debt profile is clearly unsustainable. The debt to GDP argument is not something that can stand in this type of economy, because some major components of the GDP are not revenue generating. Take, for instance, the agricultural sector. The agri sector accounts for about 23% of GDP. What is the contribution of agri to revenue? I'm not sure it's up to 2%. The distributive trade sector accounts for about 16% of GDP. What is the contribution of that sector to revenue? It's also very low. So we have a major issue with productivity of many sectors, and that is why what we should be worrying about is how to ensure that the debt situation is sustainable, and we can only do that if we relate a lot more to the capacity to service the debt. Currently, our capacity to service debt is very weak. And this is a time for very difficult choices to be made. We want to get out of this situation.
Mr. Yusuf, the LCCI had advocated a national assets register as a way to link existing debt to security. How would this work, even with the plan to sell public assets to raise revenue?
Well, the whole idea is that we should not entirely be dependent on the budget for purposes of servicing debt. If you have assets that are securitized, if you have assets that can be also made available by way of equity to raise funds, just as Saudi Arabia is doing. I mean, you can just seed off a portion of our equity in some of these assets. If you have assets that are doing well, if you have assets that are also not doing well, that is constituting a liability to the government, why not do away with them and raise funds? But beyond that, we need to deal with issues of cost. We need to deal with issues of revenue, because we are talking about fiscal sustainability. We need to deal with issues of cost of governance, because in all of this, revenue is dropping, is shrinking, but the costs are still going up. And the easiest thing to do when you have this kind of situation is to see how you can bring costs under control. That is not happening. We are spending as though it's still business as usual. So we need to deal with the issues of cost of governance, the size of the bureaucracy, the size of political appointees across all levels of government. We need to deal with issues of accountability and transparency in government across all levels of government, because as we speak, there are still a lot of issues around corruption and leakages. Then on the revenue side, the states also need to be a lot more innovative and creative with respect to revenue generation. These are very challenging times, and we have to do things differently. We also need to deal with issues of fiscal federalism. You cannot have a unitary government and you expect the states to be very viable. So issues of true federalism is also a very, very important thing that I think we need to address. We must deal with these issues very fundamentally.
Thank you so much, the Director General of the Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Mr. Muda Yusuf. A pleasure sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you very much.